Margaret Williams had been working for the Harrison family for 12 years, and, in all that time, she had never once questioned the carefully maintained boundaries of her position. At 52 years old, she moved through the sprawling Manhattan penthouse like a shadow, her presence both essential and invisible. She knew exactly how Mr. Harrison liked his morning coffee: 2 sugars, no cream, served in the blue china cup that had belonged to his mother. She knew that Mrs. Harrison preferred her breakfast tray brought to the sunroom at precisely 8:15, and that their teenage son Marcus needed to be reminded 3 times before he would get ready for school. The Harrison family lived in a world that Margaret understood but could never truly enter. Robert Harrison was one of New York's most successful real estate developers, a man whose name appeared regularly in the financial pages and whose handshake could seal deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His wife, Patricia, moved in social circles that Margaret glimpsed only through the preparations for their elaborate dinner parties. Margaret would spend days polishing silver, arranging flowers, and ensuring that every detail was perfect for guests she would never speak to beyond offering them drinks or taking their coats. But Margaret was observant. Years of working in wealthy households had taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed more than words ever could. She noticed when Mrs. Harrison's smile became strained during phone calls with certain friends. She saw how Mr. Harrison's jaw tightened when he read particular business letters. She understood that in this world of privilege and power, danger could arrive wearing the finest clothes and speaking with the most polished manners. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Margaret arrived at the penthouse at her usual time of 6:30. The doorman, Jimmy, had greeted her with his customary nod, but she noticed something different in his expression. There was a tension in his shoulders, a wariness in his eyes that made her pay closer attention as she rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. The apartment felt different too, though she couldn't immediately identify why. As she moved through her morning routine, starting the coffee, reviewing the day's schedule that Mrs. Harrison had left for her, checking that the newspapers were properly arranged, Margaret found herself listening more carefully to the sounds around her. The penthouse was usually filled with the quiet hum of expensive appliances and the distant sounds of the city below, but today there seemed to be an undercurrent of something else, a vibration of unease that she felt more than heard. Mr. Harrison emerged from his bedroom at 7:15, dressed in one of his impeccably tailored suits. At 61, he was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair that he kept perfectly groomed. Margaret had always admired his bearing, the way he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing. His father had been a construction worker, and Robert had started his career swinging a hammer on building sites before slowly working his way up to become one of the city's most influential developers. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Margaret said, presenting him with his coffee as he settled into his usual chair at the breakfast table. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the steam rising from the cup, creating small wisps that disappeared into the air like whispered secrets. "Morning, Margaret," he replied, but she noticed that his voice lacked its usual warmth. His attention was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages with more intensity than she typically observed. His free hand drummed against the table, a habit that usually emerged only when he was dealing with particularly stressful business matters. As Margaret prepared his breakfast, steel-cut oats with fresh berries and a glass of orange juice, she found herself studying his reflection in the polished surface of the coffee pot. There were new lines around his eyes, and his complexion seemed paler than usual. Whatever was troubling him was serious enough to have cost him sleep. Mrs. Harrison appeared 20 minutes later, already dressed for her day of charity meetings and lunch appointments. Patricia Harrison was a beautiful woman who had aged gracefully, her blonde hair styled in an elegant bob and her makeup applied with the skill of someone who had been appearing in society photographs for over 2 decades. But Margaret noticed that her usual morning chattiness was absent. Instead, she moved through her breakfast routine with mechanical precision, her responses to her husband's occasional comments clipped and distracted. Their son Marcus came down last, grabbing a piece of toast and his backpack with the hurried movements of a 17-year-old running late for school. Margaret watched him kiss his mother goodbye, noticed how Mrs. Harrison held him just a moment longer than usual, her hand lingering on his shoulder as if memorizing the feeling. After the family had dispersed to their various obligations, Margaret began her deeper cleaning routine. It was while she was dusting Mr. Harrison's study that she discovered the first concrete sign that something was seriously wrong. Hidden beneath a stack of architectural drawings was a letter that had apparently fallen from the desk. The letter had belonged to a law firm she didn't recognize, and, though she only caught a glimpse of the content before carefully replacing it exactly where she had found it, certain words stood out with alarming clarity: criminal investigation, federal charges, and immediate legal counsel required. Margaret had worked for enough wealthy families to understand that money often came with complications. She had seen business deals go wrong, had witnessed the stress of financial setbacks and market crashes. But the tone of this letter suggested something far more serious than ordinary business troubles. This was the kind of document that could destroy not just a fortune, but a life. Throughout the rest of the morning, Margaret found herself paying closer attention to every detail of her environment. She noticed that the phone rang more frequently than usual, and that each call seemed to increase the tension in the apartment. She observed that several pieces of mail had arrived by special courier, thick envelopes with legal firm logos that were immediately locked away in Mr. Harrison's private safe. When Mrs. Harrison returned from her morning appointments, Margaret could see that her earlier composure had cracked. Her hands shook slightly as she removed her gloves, and she asked Margaret to prepare tea with an urgency that suggested she needed something to calm her nerves. As Margaret served the tea in the sunroom, she couldn't help but notice the stack of travel brochures spread across the coffee table, not the usual vacation destinations like the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard, but exotic locations in countries that didn't have extradition treaties with the United States. The afternoon brought a stream of visitors that Margaret had never seen before. Unlike the usual parade of business associates and social friends, these men arrived quietly, without the fanfare that typically accompanied important guests. They wore expensive suits, but their faces had a hardness that spoke of lives lived in the shadows of legitimate business. Margaret served them coffee in the formal living room, her movements careful and unobtrusive, but she noticed how their conversation stopped the moment she entered the room and resumed only after she had left. One visitor in particular caught her attention. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his 30s, with the kind of lean build and alert eyes that suggested military or law enforcement training. But there was something about him that made Margaret's instincts prickle with warning. Perhaps it was the way his gaze followed her movements, or how his hand consistently rested near the inside of his jacket in a gesture that seemed more protective than casual. As the day wore on, Margaret began to notice changes in the building itself. There were more security guards than usual in the lobby, and she observed through the windows that several unmarked cars had taken up residence on the streets surrounding the building. The atmosphere of the penthouse had shifted from one of worried tension to something approaching fear. Evening brought Mr. Harrison home earlier than usual, his face grim as he entered the apartment. Margaret watched from the hallway as he embraced his wife, holding her close in a way that spoke of desperation rather than affection. Their conversation was conducted in whispers, but their body language told a story of people preparing for the worst. Dinner was a subdued affair. Marcus seemed to sense the tension in his parents, his usual teenage chatter replaced by careful questions about their plans for the upcoming weekend. Margaret served the meal with her customary efficiency, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing something historic, the last normal evening this family might ever share. As she prepared to leave for the day, Margaret performed her usual routine of ensuring that all the doors were locked and the security system was properly set. It was then that she overheard a phone conversation that chilled her to the bone. Mr. Harrison was speaking to someone in hushed tones, his words barely audible through the closed door of his study. "I understand the timeline has moved up," he was saying. "Yes, I'll be ready." "You're certain about the route? And the security arrangements?" There was a pause, and then, "I just need to know that my family will be protected. That's all I care about now." Margaret finished her tasks and gathered her belongings, but as she waited for the elevator, her mind raced through everything she had observed throughout the day. The legal documents, the suspicious visitors, the increased security, the travel brochures for countries without extradition treaties, all of it painted a picture of a man preparing to run from something terrible. But there was another element to the puzzle that troubled her even more. The young man with the military bearing and the careful way he had watched everyone in the room. The way his presence had seemed to make even the other visitors nervous. Margaret had spent enough years reading people to recognize a predator when she saw one, and every instinct she possessed told her that this man represented a threat to the family she had served so faithfully. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would be more than just an observant servant. Tomorrow, she would be ready to act on what she had learned. Because sometimes, the people who are paid to be invisible are the only ones who can see clearly enough to prevent a tragedy. The city lights blurred past the elevator windows as Margaret descended through the floors of the building, each passing level taking her further from the rarefied world of the Harrison penthouse and back to her own reality. But she carried with her the weight of knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for people she had grown to care about deeply, despite the professional distance that was supposed to define their relationship. Margaret had learned long ago that in the world of the wealthy and powerful, loyalty was a luxury that could be bought and sold like any other commodity. But some forms of loyalty ran deeper than money or obligation. Some forms of loyalty were born from years of shared mornings and quiet conversations, from watching children grow up and seeing families navigate their private struggles behind closed doors. Tomorrow would test every assumption about her place in the Harrison family's world. Tomorrow would demand that she step out of the shadows that had protected her for so long and into the light where her actions could save lives or cost her everything she had worked so hard to build. Margaret arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual the next morning, her mind still racing from the previous day's revelations. She had barely slept, turning over every detail she had observed, trying to piece together the full picture of what was happening to the Harrison family. The doorman, Jimmy, looked even more tense than he had the day before, and Margaret noticed that there were now 2 additional security guards stationed in the lobby, men she had never seen before who watched everyone who entered and left the building with professional scrutiny. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt longer than usual, each floor creating more time for Margaret's anxiety to build. When she entered the penthouse, she was struck immediately by how different it felt from the home she knew so well. Expensive suitcases sat by the front door, and she could hear the sounds of hurried packing coming from the bedrooms. Whatever was coming, it was arriving today. Mrs. Harrison emerged from the master bedroom looking haggard and exhausted, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore casual clothes instead of her typical morning attire. When she saw Margaret, her composure cracked slightly, and, for a moment, Margaret glimpsed the frightened woman beneath the polished exterior. "Margaret," she said, her voice strained with an emotion that seemed to hover between relief and desperation. "I'm so glad you're here early. We're going to be traveling unexpectedly. Could you please help me finish packing? And perhaps prepare a quick breakfast? Robert has a very important meeting this morning before we leave." The words were spoken calmly enough, but Margaret could hear the underlying current of panic. This wasn't a planned vacation or business trip. This was an escape, and the timeline was apparently much shorter than anyone had anticipated. Margaret moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, but her trained eye caught details that confirmed her worst fears. Legal documents were being fed into a paper shredder in Mr. Harrison's study. Computer hard drives sat in a box marked for secure destruction. Most telling of all, she observed Mrs. Harrison carefully packing only photographs and jewelry, the kinds of personal items that people took when they never expected to return home. As she prepared breakfast, Margaret overheard a series of phone calls that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Mr. Harrison was speaking to his lawyer, his banker, and what sounded like a private jet charter service. His voice carried the strain of a man trying to coordinate a complex escape while fighting against an accelerating timeline. "I understand the indictments are being unsealed today," she heard him say during one call. "Yes, I'm fully aware of what that means. The question is whether we can be airborne before the arrest warrants are issued." Margaret felt her stomach tighten as the implications became clear. Mr. Harrison was about to be arrested, likely on federal charges serious enough that he was willing to flee the country rather than face trial. The family that had employed her for 12 years, that had treated her with kindness and respect, was about to lose everything. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus came down from his room carrying a single backpack, his young face a mask of confusion and fear. Margaret's heart broke as she watched him trying to process what was happening to his world. He had been told they were taking an unexpected trip, but, at 17, he was old enough to sense that this was something far more serious than a spontaneous vacation. Margaret, he said quietly as she handed him a plate of toast, are we ever coming back here? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Margaret looked into his eyes that had watched her bake birthday cakes and help with homework projects, that had lit up every Christmas morning as she helped him open presents under the enormous tree in the living room. She wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, that his family would weather this storm as they had weathered others. But she could see that he was old enough for truth, even if it was painful. I don't know, Marcus, she said softly. But, whatever happens, your parents love you very much. That's something that can never change, no matter what else might happen. Around 10 o'clock, the visitor from the previous day arrived. Margaret answered the door, and, up close, her initial impressions of the man were confirmed. He moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to violence, and, when he smiled at her, it was the kind of expression that never reached his eyes. He was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, but Margaret noticed the telltale bulge under his left arm that suggested a shoulder holster. Good morning, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Margaret couldn't place. I'm here to see Mr. Harrison. I believe he's expecting me. Margaret showed him to the living room and informed Mr. Harrison of his arrival. When her employer emerged from his study, she was shocked by his appearance. In the space of one morning, Robert Harrison seemed to have aged 10 years. His usually perfect posture was stooped with exhaustion, and his hands shook slightly as he straightened his tie, a nervous habit that Margaret had observed only during his most stressful business dealings. David, Mr. Harrison said to the visitor, and Margaret filed away the name for future reference. Thank you for coming so quickly. I trust everything is arranged? The man called David smiled again, that same cold expression that made Margaret's skin crawl. Everything is taken care of, Mr. Harrison. The route has been planned, the timing coordinated. My associates are already in position. You have nothing to worry about. But, as Margaret served them coffee, she caught something in David's tone that set off every alarm bell in her mind. There was a quality to his reassurance that reminded her of the way predators talk to their prey, soothing words designed to ensure compliance rather than provide genuine comfort. Margaret had heard that tone before, years ago, when she had worked for a family whose business dealings had attracted the attention of very dangerous people. As the morning progressed, Margaret found opportunities to observe David more closely. He spent most of his time on his phone, having conversations in what sounded like multiple languages. But, it was his behavior during the moments when he thought no one was watching that truly alarmed her. She saw him making careful notes about the apartment's layout, paying particular attention to the exits and the security features. He seemed to be measuring distances and timing various movements through the space. Most disturbing of all, Margaret noticed how he watched the Harrison family. His attention wasn't that of a security professional assessing threats, it was the focused observation of someone evaluating targets. When Mrs. Harrison passed through the room, his eyes followed her with an intensity that had nothing to do with protection. When Marcus appeared, David's expression showed a cold calculation that made Margaret's blood run cold. Around 11:30, Mr. Harrison announced that it was time to leave for his final meeting before their departure. Margaret watched him embrace his wife and son with the desperation of a man who wasn't certain he would see them again. The goodbye was supposed to look like a temporary separation, but Margaret could see the finality in every gesture. The car should be here any moment, David announced, checking his watch with theatrical precision. Traffic to the airport will be heavy, so we should leave as soon as possible. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what she was witnessing. This wasn't a protective escort arranged by Mr. Harrison's lawyers or security team. This was something far more sinister. David wasn't here to help the Harrison family escape, he was here to ensure they never had the chance to testify about whatever crimes had brought federal attention to Robert Harrison's business dealings. As Mr. Harrison gathered his final belongings, Margaret made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She had spent 12 years being invisible, staying in the background, never speaking unless spoken to. But, some situations demanded that good people step forward, regardless of the personal cost. She approached Mr. Harrison as he stood in the foyer, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent as the morning progressed. David was on his phone across the room, apparently coordinating with the driver, but Margaret could sense his awareness of every movement in the apartment. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, stepping close enough that her words would be audible only to him. "You have a thread loose on your tie. May I help you straighten it?" For a moment, he looked puzzled by her offer. In 12 years, Margaret had never helped him with his appearance beyond bringing him clothes from the cleaners or ensuring his shoes were properly polished. But something in her expression must have communicated the urgency of her request, because he nodded and stood still as she reached toward his neck. As her hands moved to adjust his tie, Margaret positioned herself so that her body blocked David's view of her face. Then, speaking in a whisper so soft it was barely audible, she delivered the words that would save Robert Harrison's life: "Stay back, your driver carries a weapon." She saw the shock register in his eyes, watched as the implications of her warning crashed over him like a physical blow. But, to his credit, Mr. Harrison's expression remained neutral, giving no sign that he had received information that changed everything about his understanding of the situation. Margaret stepped back, smoothing his tie with the professional efficiency of someone completing a routine task. "There," she said in her normal voice. "That looks much better." "Thank you, Margaret," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos that must have been raging in his mind. "You've always paid attention to the details that matter most." Across the room, David finished his phone call and turned back to them with that cold smile. "The car is here, Mr. Harrison. We should go now." Margaret watched as Robert Harrison nodded calmly, apparently accepting the timeline. But she could see the subtle changes in his posture, the way his weight shifted toward the interior of the apartment rather than the exit. He was preparing to act on her warning, though she couldn't predict what form that action would take. "Of course," Mr. Harrison said to David. "I just need to get my briefcase from the study. It will only take a moment." As he walked toward his study, Margaret saw him make eye contact with his wife across the room. Some silent communication passed between them, a message transmitted through 12 years of marriage and shared understanding. "Mrs. Harrison's face remained composed, but Margaret noticed her subtly positioning herself closer to Marcus, her hand moving to rest on his shoulder in what appeared to be a casual gesture of affection. David's phone buzzed again, and he answered with apparent irritation. "What do you mean there's a delay? I specifically told you that timing was critical." His voice carried a note of frustrated anger that revealed more about his true nature than any of his previous polite interactions. It was in that moment of distraction that Mr. Harrison acted. Instead of heading toward the exit with his briefcase, he moved quickly to the panic room that had been installed behind his study during a security upgrade the previous year. Margaret heard the heavy door slam shut just as David looked up from his phone call, confusion and, then, rage playing across his features as he realized what had happened. "Where is he?" David demanded, his polite facade finally dropping completely. "Where did he go?" Margaret looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout 12 years of professional service. "I believe Mr. Harrison went to get his briefcase, sir. Perhaps he's having trouble finding something." But, even as she spoke, Margaret could hear the sound of Mr. Harrison's voice through the reinforced walls of the panic room, speaking rapidly to someone, likely his lawyer or the FBI agents who had been building the case against him. The choice had been made to surrender rather than flee, to face whatever charges awaited him rather than trust his family's safety to people whose true intentions had become terrifyingly clear. David's hand moved toward the bulge under his jacket, but, before he could draw whatever weapon he carried, the apartment's security alarms began blaring. Mr. Harrison had activated the building's emergency protocols from inside the panic room, sealing off all elevators and stairwells until police could respond. In that moment, Margaret understood that her quiet warning had done more than save one man's life. It had prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed an entire family and allowed a criminal conspiracy to claim victims who deserved justice, not execution. Sometimes the most powerful force in the world wasn't money or influence or violence, it was the courage of someone who refused to remain silent when silence meant becoming complicit in evil. The sound of the security alarms filled the penthouse with their shrill warning, but Margaret found herself strangely calm in the midst of the chaos. She had spent her entire life learning to read dangerous situations, to sense when the careful balance of power was about to shift. Now, watching David's facade crumble as he realized his carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart, she felt the satisfaction of someone who had finally acted on her instincts instead of simply observing from the sidelines. David's hand was halfway to his weapon when the apartment door burst open and a team of FBI agents flooded into the room, their own weapons drawn and ready. Margaret later learned that Mr. Harrison's lawyer had been coordinating with federal investigators for weeks, setting up a controlled surrender that would protect his family while ensuring that the evidence of his crimes was properly preserved for prosecution.
David Kozlov, the lead agent, announced, his voice cutting through the alarm noise with professional authority.
"You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and violation of the RICO Act." Margaret watched as David's expression shifted through a rapid series of emotions: surprise, anger, and, finally, a cold calculation as he measured his chances of escape against the odds of survival. For a moment, she thought he might try to fight his way out, but the apartment was now filled with enough federal agents to prevent any possibility of success. As they placed handcuffs on David, Margaret caught his eyes one last time. There was a moment of recognition between them, an acknowledgement that she had been the variable he hadn't accounted for in his plans. He had dismissed her as irrelevant, a piece of furniture that moved through the apartment without agency or intelligence. That dismissal had been his critical mistake.
"Ma'am," one of the agents said, approaching Margaret with professional courtesy. "We're going to need to speak with you about what you observed here today. Are you willing to cooperate with our investigation?"
Margaret nodded, understanding that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't fully predict. She had spent 12 years in the background of this family's story, but now she would become a central figure in a federal case that would likely dominate headlines for months. The panic room door opened with a heavy mechanical sound, and Mr. Harrison emerged looking like a man who had aged decades in the span of an hour. His face was pale, his hands shaking, but there was relief in his eyes as he saw that his family was safe and that David was in custody. "Patricia, Marcus," he said, his voice breaking as he gathered them into his arms.
"I'm so sorry.
I'm so sorry for what I've brought into our home." Margaret watched the family reunion from across the room, understanding that this might be their last time together for a very long time. Whatever crimes Mr. Harrison had committed, whatever plea bargain he had negotiated with federal prosecutors, it would likely involve a prison sentence that would separate him from his wife and son for years. As the FBI agents processed the crime scene and began conducting preliminary interviews, Margaret learned more about the web of corruption that had ensnared the Harrison family. David Kozlov was part of a Russian organized crime syndicate that had been using Robert Harrison's real estate developments to launder money from drug trafficking and human smuggling operations. When Harrison had attempted to extricate himself from the partnership and cooperate with federal investigators, the syndicate had decided that the safest course was to eliminate him and his family entirely. The plan had been elegantly simple in its cruelty. David would pose as a security consultant hired to protect the Harrison family during their escape from the country. The driver he had arranged was actually a professional assassin who would have killed all three family members during what would appear to be a robbery gone wrong during their trip to the airport. Their deaths would have eliminated the primary witnesses against the syndicate while sending a clear message to other potential cooperators. Margaret's intervention had saved not just Robert Harrison's life, but the lives of his entire family. Her warning had given him the crucial seconds he needed to choose protection over flight, surrender over escape. It was a choice that would cost him his freedom for the next 7 to 10 years, but it had preserved the lives of the people he loved most. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself at the center of a storm of attention that felt completely foreign to someone who had spent her career being invisible. FBI agents interviewed her for hours, going over every detail of her observations from the past 2 days. Prosecutors wanted to understand exactly how she had recognized the threat that had fooled everyone else, including trained security professionals. "Mrs. Williams," Agent Sarachin said during one of their conversations, "you potentially prevented a triple homicide today. What made you suspicious of Mr. Kozlov when no one else, including Mr. Harrison, sensed any danger?" Margaret thought carefully before answering. How could she explain a lifetime of learning to read the subtle signs that revealed people's true intentions? How could she describe the survival instincts that came from existing in spaces where she was simultaneously essential and vulnerable? "I've worked in houses like this for most of my adult life," she finally said. I've seen how people in power interact with each other, and I've learned to recognize when someone doesn't belong in that world. Mr. Kozlov had the clothes and the manners, but his eyes were wrong. They were the eyes of someone who saw people as objects instead of human beings. Agent Chen nodded, understanding more than Margaret had expected. You noticed behavioral patterns that suggested predatory intent rather than protective concern. I suppose that's one way to put it, Margaret agreed. But, mostly, I just listened to my instincts. When you spend your life taking care of other people, you develop a sense for when someone means them harm. The media attention began almost immediately. News crews gathered outside the building, and Margaret found herself thrust into a spotlight that felt both overwhelming and surreal. The story had everything that captured public imagination: wealth, corruption, international crime syndicates, and an unlikely hero whose quick thinking had prevented tragedy. But Margaret was uncomfortable with the label of hero. She understood that her actions had been important, but she also knew that they had grown naturally from skills and insights she had developed over decades of careful observation. She hadn't set out to save anyone's life, she had simply acted on information that seemed crucial to share. The Harrison family's gratitude was overwhelming and genuine, but it came with complications that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Harrison wanted to provide her with a financial reward that would ensure her security for the rest of her life. Mr. Harrison, even facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, was determined to establish a trust fund that would recognize her service and sacrifice. But Margaret found herself struggling with the implications of such generosity. Accepting a large financial reward felt like it might change the nature of what she had done, transforming an act of moral courage into a transaction with monetary value. She had acted to save lives, not to secure her own financial future. The legal proceedings moved quickly once David Kozlov was in custody. His arrest led to a series of raids that dismantled significant portions of the money laundering operation, resulting in dozens of additional arrests across multiple states. The evidence that Robert Harrison had been gathering for months proved crucial in prosecuting the higher-level members of the syndicate. Margaret found herself called to testify before a federal grand jury, an experience that required her to relive the events of that morning in precise detail. She described David's behavior, the phone calls she had overheard, and the moment when her instincts had convinced her that the Harrison family was in immediate danger. The grand jury proceedings were closed to the public, but word leaked about Margaret's role in preventing the murders. Suddenly, she found herself the subject of intense media interest. Reporters wanted to know about her background, her relationship with the Harrison family, and her perspective on the events that had made her a reluctant public figure. Margaret agreed to a single interview with a respected journalist, hoping that telling her story once might reduce the constant pressure for access. She spoke about her childhood in rural North Carolina, her move to New York as a young woman seeking better opportunities, and the 30 years she had spent working in domestic service for wealthy families. "I've been fortunate to work for good people who treated me with respect," she said during the interview. "The Harrison family has been like a second family to me. When I realized they were in danger, I couldn't stay silent. It wasn't heroic, it was just human." The interview resonated with people across the country who saw in Margaret's story a reminder that courage often came from unexpected sources. She received thousands of letters from people sharing their own experiences of moments when they had to choose between safety and moral action. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other domestic workers, housekeepers, nannies, caregivers, who wrote to tell her that her actions had given them hope that their observations and insights mattered. Many shared stories of situations where they had seen things that troubled them but had felt powerless to act because of their position in their employers' households. As the weeks passed and the initial media frenzy began to subside, Margaret found herself grappling with questions about her future that she had never expected to face. The Harrison family would be relocating after Robert's release from prison, and the penthouse where she had worked for 12 years would be sold to help pay legal fees and victim restitution. Mrs. Harrison approached her with an offer that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. A foundation was being established to provide scholarships and support services for domestic workers seeking education and career advancement. They wanted Margaret to serve as the foundation's first executive director, using her experience and newfound public platform to advocate for workers who often remained invisible in the households where they served. It was an opportunity that would have terrified the Margaret who had arrived at work that Tuesday morning focused only on maintaining the careful boundaries that had defined her professional life. But, the events of recent weeks had shown her that those boundaries could be crossed when circumstances demanded moral courage. Margaret accepted the position, understanding that her new role would require her to step permanently out of the shadows that had protected and limited her for so long. She would become a voice for people who were rarely heard, an advocate for workers whose contributions were often taken for granted. The irony wasn't lost on her that David Kozlov's attempt to exploit her invisibility had ultimately led to her emergence as a public figure with the platform to address issues of inequality and justice that had shaped her entire life. Sometimes the most powerful victories came from turning an enemy's assumptions against them. As Margaret in the glittering world of corporate power and luxury limousines, where million-dollar deals are made with handshakes and fortunes can vanish with a single phone call, the most dangerous threats often come from those closest to you. This is the true story of Margaret Williams, a black domestic worker whose keen instincts and split-second decisions saved the life of one of America's most powerful business tycoons. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning in a Manhattan penthouse would become a deadly game of deception, where loyalty was bought with blood money and the difference between life and death came down to a servant's courage to break the unspoken rules of silence that governed her world. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't money or influence, it's the wisdom of someone who has learned to read danger in the smallest details, someone whose very survival has depended on understanding the true nature of the people around them. This is Margaret's story, a tale that reveals how the overlooked and underestimated can possess the clearest vision of all.